Well, thank you to all of you, and thank you to Denmark for this opportunity. We've been through a lot of interesting discussions, which are in some ways quite depressing, like what you see on the screen and what you still see on the screen. And all of this, all of this chaos and anger we have about the fact that we have been and are being lied to by so-called officials, like this one as well. And what I would like to do is I'd actually like to try to uplift you, because history, as we've been taught in school, to some degree is a lie. And I wouldn't call it conspiracy theory, but what I would call it is people closely guarding information and refusing to open themselves up to scrutiny or other people coming in and offering additional information. And so this is the typical story we've been told about humanity, that we evolved from a primitive state to we being, quote unquote, the most evolved of all of existence. And the same with society. We've been taught over and over that Homo sapiens, who we are, started out approximately 200,000 years ago, and for the majority of that time, we lived in this state of the hunter-gatherer. And then maybe 10,000 years ago, people got the idea to start living in a sedentary place, communally, and that now in the 21st century we have the city of Shanghai. And this is supposed to be the ultimate example of the expression of humanity. The two places that I'm intimate with and want to discuss are Peru and Bolivia, and also Egypt, because they spiritually and in terms of tourism, etc., are, except for Egypt at the moment, the hottest places for people to go to in order to study ancient things. But the thing is that we have left the history of both of these places and much of the rest of the world, if not all of the world, to a small group of people, in general called archaeologists and anthropologists, to tell us the history of humanity. And the problem I had with the first trip I made to Peru was the fact that I saw buildings of such phenomenal construction that what the archaeologists told me in terms of these tools, bronze chisels and stone hammers, which were the highest level of technical sophistication both in ancient Egypt and in Peru, were responsible for all of the constructions I was looking at. And so through the course of time, I've had the ability to bring engineers, stonemasons, geologists, and other experts outside of the archaeological field in to look at them and tell me from their perspective how this was done. And 100% of the time, they said that those tools could not have been responsible. And it clearly was not cultures afterwards because of the great antiquity. So what I'd like to start you with is the Inca. The Inca were the largest civilization in pre-Columbian America, but nobody actually knows where the Inca came from after all this 800 years of their history. Supposedly they came from the area of Lake Titicaca, and the archaeological evidence tells us that they most likely came from the island of the Sun and the island of the Moon in Lake Titicaca. And what's important is what you're looking at is an Inca building. That's how the Inca built their structures, using bronze chisels and stone hammers. This is on the island of the Sun, and this is also on the island of the Sun. And you can imagine, whether you've worked with stone or not, that with that level of technology, this is achievable. As well as this. This is the same kind of construction, but with adobe mud as well. However, the other idea is that the Inca came from a place called Tiwanaku, which is in Bolivia, But the problem we have with the site of Tiwanaku is not only that it looks more sophisticated, but the entire place was reconstructed by French and Bolivian archaeologists in the 1960s. They put these buildings back together without any reference. They interpreted what they were doing, and they honestly made a complete mess of it. Because this, for example, which is called the Sun Gate, is a single piece of stone. The crack you see happened much after it was built, but it weighs 10 tons, and it was moved from its quarry 70 kilometers away. So the question is, how did ancient primitive people move it? There are no trees at that elevation of 13,000 feet. So it's one of the many enigmatic things we'll look at. The other is this surface. And I took an engineer called Christopher Dunn, who had been to the site of Pumapunku, which is also at Tiwanaku, to look at this. And he has instruments, because he worked in the aviation industry, he has precision measuring instruments which are technically almost perfect. And this stone, for example, over the space of at least 1 foot, if not longer, the surface does not deviate more than 2/10,000ths of an inch out of perfect flatness. And you can't do that with primitive technology, but the archaeologists insist that it was done using those tools. And about 10 years ago, some German architects took some of the stones at Pumapunku and showed what they originally would have looked like, which is this. And that, again, is way beyond what a Bronze Age culture could have possibly created. Also, what we find at these sites, and we find them actually at all of the megalithic, which means massive stone sites in Peru and Bolivia, are these strange elongated skulls. And the problem is that this display, for example, which is at Tiwanaku, has been shut down. You're not allowed to look at the skulls anymore. That could be conspiracy. But no one has ever carbon dated these skulls, and no one has ever DNA tested these skulls, but the archaeologists automatically assumed that these people, or some would say beings, were directly responsible for these constructions, and that is insufficient. Even the Inca people are always portrayed like this. They are very Indian looking, they have long black hair. The problem is that when the Spanish arrived in Peru, and the reason why they were able to overtake the Inca was the Inca were involved in a civil war at the time, and almost the entire royal population, who were the actual Inca. The Inca was not the population, it was the royal family. They had been exterminated. So this is what Spanish portrait painters interpreted as being what the Inca looked like, and Peruvians to this day think that that's what they looked like, but we don't honestly know. But what we do know is that the Inca had to leave the Lake Titicaca area about 900 AD because of a very massive drought. And so they wound up going north and into this area called the Sacred Valley, which is outside of Cusco. And the Sacred Valley is called that because it has been agriculturally productive for thousands of years. And in order to develop any level of high sophistication as a civilization, water and its abundance and being able to grow huge amounts of food is what is critically important. So as the Inca were traveling from Lake Titicaca to Cusco, they encountered an earlier culture called the Wari, and this is Wari construction. Again, very simple. But then what archaeologists say is that as soon as the Inca started to build the city of Cusco, they did this kind of work. But what you'll see, again, up above, you'll see that is Inca style, but it's based on a foundation of megalithic blocks. And the megalithic work is far more sophisticated than what the Inca did. So this is insinuating that the megalithic wall is older. And this building, called the Coricancha, which is in Cusco, is believed to have been the first building that the Inca ever built. And again, there is no mortar, there's no clay, there's no cement, there's no glue. This is stone on top of stone. And the precision of the construction is so tight-fitting, you cannot fit a human hair in between the blocks. And inside of the Coricancha, we find strange shaped stones which have no real explanation archaeologically. They're just kind of jumbled up in piles because they don't fit in, again, with the picture that we're being told. And this is my favorite because this is a drill hole in a stone. It's about this long, but both ends of the stone are broken, so we have no idea how far that hole went. And if you look at the scarring marks horizontally, going this way, you can see, and engineers have backed this up, modern engineers, that it must have been some kind of boring tool that was a very high vibration. It wasn't a drill that moved like this. It was a very high vibrational cutter. The teeth would have had to have been something like diamond in order to cut through, because this is harder than granite. But again, it's an artifact which archaeologists basically don't want to discuss. And then this is a stone tub or container of some kind, which is in the very center of this building. And the flowers that are planted around it are not just there to look good. You are literally not allowed to step inside and photograph what this is, because somebody doesn't want this artifact studied. But what's intriguing is that about 10 years ago, a team was allowed to do excavations at number 8, which is this building, the Coricancha, and up on top at number 1, which is Sacsayhuaman. And they found a tunnel system cut through solid bedrock, connecting one with the other. The Inca could not have done that. So what I'm telling you is I believe that Cusco was an ancient city that was abandoned for some reason, and after thousands of years, the Inca went to Cusco, rebuilt their city, but now because of their construction and then Spanish construction and modern construction, it's difficult to see the oldest parts. But as you train your eyes, and this is what our tours do, you automatically see the different periods of building. The oldest is always the biggest stone and always the finest stone, and that's counter to what we're taught about society. Even in Inca times, the Coricancha building and where that tub is was called the center or the navel of the world. And it's from there that they believed energy moved out either from the center out or from the outside in. And I believe that's a concept that the Inca inherited from some energetic principle which is still at work inside this building. And as we step outside the Coricancha, there is this street here which is aligned to the winter solstice, which is an interesting thing. But more importantly, when you go up close to this, again, on this side, this is Inca work, but it's built on top of something larger and older. And that's a simple indication that somebody was there previously of a higher level of technical ability. And again, excavations have been done. These elongated skulls show up, and they have not been carbon-14 tested for age. Neither have they been DNA tested, but they're labeled as being Inca. And outside of this building, the Coricancha, again, it becomes more and more obvious. You're looking at Inca work here, probably Inca work up there, reconstruction of the wall here, and then that, which is the finest built wall in the Americas. Again, in many places, you cannot fit a human hair in between the stones, and it's more than 1 meter thick. It's not hollow. It's continuous. And that would not be impossible today, but would be an incredible technical challenge. As well, we find these strange knobs exposed, and there has been no proper reasoning as to why they exist. There's another type of construction that these ancient builders, who I actually call the Pirwas, and that is from a very obscure manuscript written by a 17th century Spanish chronicler who was victimized by all the other historians. His name was Fernando de Montesinos, and he learned from what was left of the ancient Inca priesthood that there was a race of people who appeared 40 years after what they called the flood, and they built a city. And Peru comes from the name Pirwa. But what's intriguing about this is that you can see that it's polygonal construction. Every stone is a different shape and size. And the conventional story is that the Inca would find a stone of approximately the right shape it, put it into place, find something else, something that would fit somehow, and then shape it and fit it into place. But when you learn from the people of the area, what you find out is the builders, whoever they were, also put pictograms or animal figures into their construction. In this case, it's the shape of a puma, there and there. So that makes their construction job even more complex because, again, there's no mortar in between. And mortar is not used, even in modern times, as something that strengthens a building. It's actually weaker than the building material. Concrete is not as hard in general as stone. So to do construction without mortar is much more difficult than to do it with mortar. And the Greeks and the Romans, though they were great people, they all used mortar to fill in spaces as they were constructing things. And here again we have another example. It's an interesting shape, and it's the shape of a snake. Now, it's not only in Peru that we find this kind of work. This is actually in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo in Japan. And it again is a wall section which is not talked about, but because it blends in with all the rest of it, it's said to have been built at the same time. And this is another example in Japan as well. And on the island of Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, there are 2 or 3 sites, again, which have this incredibly precise non-mortar fitting together. And the Easter Island Polynesians were not Bronze Age, they were Stone Age people. So how could they shape basalt, which is so hard, so tight-fitting, to construct something like this? The other thing a lot of you may not know is that the so-called Easter Island heads, of which there are more than 900, none of them are heads. Every single one is a full body. So here you see the excavation of one going down. And Thor Heyerdahl in the 1950s was the first to discover this. And the best example is here. They dug down, and they were able to go down at least to where the statue itself, there were no legs, but it went down to the navel. And that's another reason why Easter Island's ancient name symbolically was called the navel of the world. I was there with Dr. Robert Schock, who was the geologist who was able to redate the Sphinx in Egypt as being older than the dynastic Egyptians because he is an expert on the weathering of stone. And he, as a PhD geologist from Boston University, has no problem to say that he believes some of these were constructed at least 12,000 years ago. And we'll get into related things about that. There's another site some of you may have heard about called Göbekli Tepe, which I've not been to, but which is in Turkey. And it seems to have been buried either on purpose or as the result of a cataclysm at least 10 to 12,000 years ago. And again, the timeline we're told is that Sumeria, Egypt, China, and India were the beginnings of civilization 6,000 years ago. And even as early as, or as recent as last week, Graham Hancock, who was there at Göbekli Tepe, the latest carbon-14 testing they found of the soil in the area shows that some of these are at least 14,000 years ago. And this is only a tiny piece of the site. There may be, this site, which looks reasonably large, could be at least 30 times as large as it is. And this just shows you more of what Göbekli Tepe looks like. And this shows you the scale. Now this, I believe, is actually what Inca construction looked like. at its height. This is the finest work they did, and this could have been achieved with bronze chisels and stone hammers. And what also happens is because the Spanish deconstructed a lot of Cusco in order to build their own buildings when they arrived in 1533 and afterwards, they took the buildings apart, which were Inca, because they were quite small stones, the size of a shoebox or a little bit better. And so what this shows us on the interior is, I think, that what the Inca were doing were replicating the work of the older people. The interior of this wall, you can see, is fill. But the front looks really nice and tight. But this, again, because this wall has been taken apart partially, the front of it is a veneer appearance of being beautiful stone construction. But because it separates as it goes back, the Inca were cheating by trying to achieve the same tightness of work. And this, again, is back in the Coricancha. And from the front of the wall, because this one was broken, from the front to the back, again a distance of about a meter, in many places you cannot fit a human hair. And all it would take would be a few millimeters of one bit of that lower stone to be raised up, and one would pivot on the other, but they don't. They fit perfectly, and they are beyond earthquake-proof. Now again, these very ancient people, the so-called Pirwas, and some call them the Viracochas, are depicted in sculpture at the site called Tiwanaku. And what we can see is in the depictions, they're shown to have beards, and that is not a Native American characteristic. And this is where Thor Heyerdahl got his Kon-Tiki image from that was on his sail, because these ancient people were called Kon-Tiki Viracocha. And he was vilified by the scientific community for his theories that people were able to move across the Pacific and other oceans thousands of years before the Europeans did. But the thing is, at least Thor Heyerdahl had the guts to build a ship and get on board and test it, whereas most academics sit behind a chair and argue back that it's impossible. This is one of the most profound sites in Peru, and this is called Sacsayhuaman. And here you see the size of the people compared to the size of the building blocks. Some of these stones are 125 tons, and local guides will say that the quarry was right there, but it's more likely that the quarry is at least 72 kilometers away and at a altitude almost 1,000 meters lower than this location. So how were those stones moved? And even more recently, some Russian geologists took samples from this site and analyzed it, and they honestly believe that what it is concrete. But not concrete that you pour, some kind of concrete you can shape, and that the wall itself, or the stones on the surface, have been heat treated to at least 1,000 degrees Celsius. And this is not something you do with a little bonfire as you're working. And here I am, and this just shows you again the sense of scale, but also these people decided to do pictograms. And so above my head is actually the shape of a puma's paw. You can see the paw and the four toes. And again, also at Sacsayhuaman, we see examples of this, where you have this incredible cutting precision in stone, which is, there's the so-called Mohs scale, which is the hardness of materials. Diamond is 10. It's the ultimate in natural materials. This stone is about 7. Bronze is about 3.5. You can't cut stone like this with bronze tools. It would be like trying to cut a tree down with a plastic knife. It's impossible. The tool has to be harder than the material. But not only that, it is perfectly level, within 1/10 of 1 degree. And some people say this was a quarry, but if it was a quarry, why would you be so precise about cutting the surface perfectly level like that? And in the area, we find these other cutout stones like this, and the weathering on this is so excessive that I'm hoping that Dr. Robert Schock will come in July of next year and be able to tell us when the stone cutting was actually achieved, because it's not like there are 1 or 10 or 50 stones like this. In the area of Cusco and the Sacred Valley, according to Jesus Gomara, who is the local expert, there are more than 5,000 of them. So when people say this was an Inca throne, there were a lot of Inca, obviously. And this one is even more dramatic, because if you see the front, this one here and that one, and even the one in behind, at one time all three were interconnected. Something happened to this massive stone with an upside-down staircase. It's much larger than a bus. Something caused it to snap into 3 pieces. It could have been a very ancient cataclysm. And again, we find just structure after structure. It looks molded, or like concrete or something. And again, another example, as we get closer to this, which is called Amaru Machai, again, you see the erosion of it. This is very hard limestone, but it's unlikely, though we need a geologist to corroborate it, it's unlikely that this is the result of weathering during the time of the Incas. It looks too old, and if you've ever been to Turkey, you see a lot of this kind of thing too. And there's talk of sites in Turkey being thousands and thousands of years old, like Göbekli Tepe is. On the interior of this one, there are surfaces which are so polished, some people again say that whoever did the work applied some kind of high heat to it to melt the surface and make it glass-like. And this is another example of that. And here is a site called Pisac, and you can see the wall in the front is of much higher quality than the work in the back, but it's all said to have been done at the same time. And how would you have people of such different technical ability working side by side to create such a difference in construction? And one of our favorite sites is in a cave outside of Cusco, and this actually is not on the tourist map, and as far as I know has not been discussed by archaeologists much. It's just an astonishing sculpting of a stone surface with unknown tools. And inside the same cave, we have this, which is kind of inexplicable because it's a false door and it doesn't go anywhere. But somebody was able to cut into the stone surface like that, one would presume with reasonable ease. And again, we have the same kind of symbol, but what is kind of important about this is that what we see at most of the major so-called Inca sites is you'll see 3 levels of construction. You see this, which is very precise cutting and shaping. Next to it, you have stones interlocking into it without mortar. And then in the back, you have mortar work. And the work in the back we know is Inca, but whoever did this other, we honestly, we theorize. Now, this is a very famous symbol for anyone who has been to Peru. It's called the Chacana, which means the Andean cross. And it, though being a simple symbol, is incredibly complicated in terms of what all of these angles and facets represent. But what's kind of more intriguing is where you see it says Ruta Viracocha, and that means the way of Viracocha or the path of Viracocha. And if you look at a map of Peru, including Bolivia, there is this so-called path, and along it, all of the major archaeological sites of super great antiquity, including Tiwanaku, Pucara, Cusco, Machu Picchu, Ollantaytambo, and Cajamarca are all within a very narrow band of that one specific line for some very strange reason. And at the site of Ollantaytambo, which is actually one of the largest complexes in Peru, or actually the world, we distinctly see very different styles of construction, though it was said that this was built probably over the course of 20 or 30 years. What you see are the magnificent Inca terraces here, which the Inca were responsible for. They were masters of agriculture and engineering on a Bronze Age level. But as we go higher up, then we start to encounter other ways of construction which are far more difficult. And especially in this picture, you see these massive blocks of granite, some weighing 40 tons and some 60 tons, that somehow made it up onto this mountain, because the quarry, which we've been to, is across the valley and up the side of a mountain. So somehow, minimum of 60-ton blocks were moved down the mountain, across the valley, across the river, and then up on top here, and they fit still with amazing precision. Especially as you can see here, again, where I am, you cannot fit a human hair from the right side to the left side. That block is perfect or almost technically perfect in terms of how it fits with the ones underneath of it. And what is likely is that this again was an example of what happened when there was a cataclysm in the distant past, destroying the beautiful megalithic ancient things, and then when the Inca arrived, they rebuilt around it. And this actually is Jesus Gamarra, who's the expert, in front of what is left of the intact part of the so-called Sun Temple. But on the right-hand side of this wall, we see this, which is Inca period reconstruction. And you can see that if the Inca were responsible for all of this work, they would have fit one next to the other. They wouldn't have filled it with rubble or fill like that. But I honestly believe that this was the Incas' attempt at trying to rebuild something that technically was just beyond their capability. And other evidence we have is this photograph was taken in 1930, before there was any kind of reconstruction by archaeologists or the tourist board or anyone. And this, I believe, shows us also because the Spanish prohibited anyone from visiting these sites when they arrived in Peru, because this was regarded as pagan. So it was out of bounds. And so I believe what you're looking at is Inca construction on top of something which is far more ancient. And this as well, I believe, is an example, I've shown this to engineers, of how the stone was actually cut. It wasn't done with chisels, it wasn't done with lasers. It was possibly, according to some engineers, done with some kind of vibrational or sonic tool that was able to destabilize the stone with a very narrow path of energy. And what we do find is we do find perfect 90-degree angles, but in general, these ancient builders were not interested in the linear way that we approach construction. They were more interested in organic ways, which makes it a very difficult job actually for engineers when you take them, because they don't understand why they would do the construction technique that they did. It looks far more difficult than to do it in the standard, what we would call a Western technique. And this is another example of where stone has been extracted from the bedrock using an unknown kind of technology. The question is, you can cut down one side, cut down the other side, cut down the bottom, but how do you extract the stone? How do you get in behind it to cut it down is the question that most engineers have, and archaeologists in general don't even want to bother to look at this sort of thing. And just more examples. Across the valley from Ollantaytambo is this mountain. And if you look, you can see buildings clinging to the side, which are great achievements of the Inca civilization. We know because as we go up there, we can see the construction technique. But one of the anomalies we see here is this, which may be kind of difficult to see in the picture, but it is the profile of a human head, about 500 feet tall. A lot of people will say that it's natural, but as you get closer to it, I think as a sculptor, somebody was responsible. Here we see the mouth, we see a fang or a tooth, and then the eye there. And it very much, once you see it, it's difficult to dismiss it as being a natural phenomenon. And Machu Picchu, of course, is the most famous ancient site in South America, said to have been built by the Inca over the course of 30 years, about 600 years ago. But once you start to look at the stonework in Cusco and other places and visit Machu Picchu, you start to see the same situation. You see, obviously, the Inca did an incredible amount of work in this location, such as these amazing terraces. But you see, it's stone stacked upon stone. It's all local stone, which has been used. But this is a photograph from 1911 when it was discovered by Hiram Bingham. And already you can see the difference. Contrary to what some people say, Machu Picchu was not totally overgrown by plants, but it was high enough in an obscure enough area that it's difficult to see unless you're actually up there looking at it. But again, you see quite rough work here, but then this megalithic area, which is in the spiritual core of the city, or so-called city of Machu Picchu. And that's a phenomenon we find not only here or in Peru, but in general. If you're looking for the oldest work, look for the core of the most ancient of sites, and that usually is where you'll find the oldest. From there, other work has been done on top of it and then expanding out. But in some places, there's so much work that has been done that it's difficult to see the actual oldest part of it. But this makes it kind of obvious. 1913, when they were digging Machu Picchu out, it revealed huge, beautifully constructed work such as this. And this is the famous Temple of Three Windows, right in the same tiny area. Now, the Intihuatana, which is called the Hitching Post of the Sun, is the iconic aspect of Machu Picchu. It's the center of the ancient part of Machu Picchu. And it's not simply a sculpted stone, it's in fact the top of the mountain. It's the exposed peak. Below it is a mountain of solid granite, white granite, with a very high quartz content. And what we find out as we explore Egypt and Peru and Bolivia is that the ancient megalithic builders didn't simply find big stones and use them. They went specifically for stone that was high in quartz and possibly iron. And because quartz has piezoelectric properties, it's possible that what these people were looking for and why they were constructing with it was because of the electrical or vibratory nature of the stone itself. And that's why they would go great distances to bring megalithic blocks into places in order to construct them. It had to have a certain quality in the material. Now, what the Intihuatana hitching post does do is that it is perfectly aligned to north, south, east, and west, but it also points, each one of those cardinal directions points to a mountain. And when we were there at one time, we brought a compass with us, and these two gentlemen repeated this process 10 times. They took the compass and brought it in close to it without touching it 10 times, and every time the compass deviated by between 5 and 10 degrees. Now you're not allowed to be too close to the structure. They say it's because they don't want people touching it, but if you're a conspiracy theorist, maybe they don't want close examination. And a lot of Peru is starting to be that way. They're cordoning off areas so you're not allowed to go in and make measurements and things. And I think this is an obvious example of where you see three distinct building styles, all done in exactly the same place, but for unknown reasons. Not something you would do probably if you were building something quite rapidly, but I think what you're looking at is the oldest, the middle, and then the Inca levels of work. And this is simply another beautiful construction inside a cave on the backside of Machu Picchu that most people don't go and have a look at. But it is so incredibly integrated. Again, mortarless work. And as we travel out from the city of Cusco, actually heading back towards Lake Titicaca, what you can see here is you see adobe construction predominantly, but underneath it is a megalithic foundation. And if the megalithic work was done structurally by the Inca, you would think they would produce a beautifully straight line where one material intersected the other. But it literally looks as though they found a ruin and built on top of it, which I think definitely is the case. Because even though in the Spanish chronicles they would say that, that the Inca so-and-so built a structure, it could very well be interpreted as that he built at the structure, built on something that was older. This is a site called Silustani, which is near Lake Titicaca, and these are called Chulpa burial towers because there's an opening, very small, on the eastern side. And so the story is that when the sun would rise, it's related to rebirth, because the Inca were supposedly worshipers of the sun, etc. But when I've taken engineers there, they look at how it was built. The internal material here is of a higher density than the external shell. And also the cupping that you see in an intact one, the outer wall had these hollow pockets. And when I went inside one of these with the engineer Christopher Dunn, he was able to figure out that the perfect harmonic of the interior of it was A sharp. And so that is a very special frequency in many ancient sites for some reason. And the other thing is that all of the damage to these, of which there are many, of these Chulpa towers, goes from the east to the west. Most people will say it was the Spanish tearing the buildings down, but the pattern of it would insinuate, because some of these, the stones are much larger, they're almost the size of an automobile, and they are hundreds of feet away from the original construction, that there was some kind of acoustic disturbance in the distant past that literally exploded the site. And the same can be seen at Machu Picchu. You'll find these megalithic buildings where the stones have been pulled apart, not by people trying to pry them apart, but by some massive disturbance that literally pulled them and spaced the building blocks. This is a site called Aramu Muru, and I just show it because it's a spiritual mecca for people, but I don't think there's anything great in terms of its technical precision. But it's becoming a major tourist site on the shore of Lake Titicaca. But what's kind of intriguing is that the previous picture, which is Silustani, as well as this site, and Tiwanaku, 10,000 years ago, the water level was high enough that the shore of the lake was lapping at all these three sites at the same time, as if intimating that they were all used originally at that time. And then Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, which is the strangest place on the planet, I believe. A lot of people, many people believe ancient aliens were responsible for its construction, but it's the precision of the stonework is profound. Again, you take a metal ruler and you place it on a lot of the surfaces, and there's no movement, and you can't see light. If you take a flashlight, you can't see light in between. So a lot of these surfaces are within 2/10,000ths of an inch of being as flat as a glass table, if not better. Now, the thing about Pumapunku is that it was buried under mud, under a wall of mud that happened at some time in the distant past, and the majority of it is still buried. The Bolivian government has not gotten around to do much in terms of excavation there. But again, 10,000 years ago, the water of Lake Titicaca would have been lapping right at this site, whereas now it seems abandoned in the middle of nowhere. And these are the famous H blocks, which, if anyone knows anything about Pumapunku, these are the most interesting feature. There are about 10 of them, and no one has any idea what they were, how they could possibly have fit together. And again, a drawing made of what they would have originally looked like is this. And it's just inexplicable that a primitive culture, could have or would have bothered doing this kind of work. We don't, and I'll be going back in October and November, hopefully with a very intense magnifying glass, because so far we've not been able to find any tool marks at all, which is very strange. Usually when you cut something, the tool will leave a saw mark or a drill mark. And then if you're a master craftsman, your job is to make the tool marks disappear. But in this case, we don't see any. And throughout the Tiwanaku site, you see these very strange cut stones of no known function. These holes are not simply squares that fit, square cuts that fit down. They taper inwards, as if they were supposed to lock something into place. And once again, wherever we travel in the highlands of Peru and Bolivia and find these ancient megalithic works, we also find the evidence of the presence of these obscure, elongated skulled people. And that's work I'm definitely still working on. Also at Pumapunku, we have evidence. I've taken a drill bit, and in a lot of cases, this one specific measurement or size of drill bit will fit perfectly, but not without a gap in each one of these holes. So somebody at some time seemed to have been there with a tool at least of cobalt steel, tungsten carbide, or diamond, being able to bore into this stone, which again is about 7 out of 10 of the hardest stones on earth. In an obscure part of Bolivia, we have a site called Samaipata, which I've not been to. But this is a giant stone outcrop of sandstone, several acres in size, and it's said to have been built by the Inca. This was built by the Inca, but no one knows who did all the work in the background. And again, you see the level of erosion involved. And in obscure museums in Peru, we find evidence of the possibility that somebody in very ancient times had high-speed drill bits and power drills. This is not something that you would be going like this with a bow saw to try to bore through. In other cases, we find examples of what looked like a massive cataclysm occurred. This is approximately the size of an automobile, and you can see that whoever made it shaped it almost perfectly, and the break would have had to have happened after it was finished, not while it was in process, because there's no surface on this massive stone that shows partial completion. It's complete, now it's broken like a piece of styrofoam. And at other locations, this is in the area of Ancash in the Peruvian highlands, and again you have this strange mix of building styles. You have kind of rough work here, but then you have these two strange columns. Why are there 2 columns and not 10 or more of them? Samples by a Japanese group of geologists of these 2 pillars were taken, and supposedly they have not been able to establish where on earth the stone comes from. It's not local, it doesn't seem to be Peruvian, but they've not been able to locate exactly where the quarry is that they came from. And even farther north, there is this channel which is carved into the bedrock, which at this point is about 8 kilometers long, and originally it would have been much longer, because if you go to one end or the other end, you can see where it's been so filled in over time that it no longer functions as a way to distribute water. But it's just one of these, it's a very strange one of many, many sites in Peru that most tourists have never been to. It also has these right-angle channels in it. Now, in terms of time, like when would this have been this ancient work, when could it have been made? And there's growing evidence about a time of about 11,500 to 11,700 years ago. This book is by Allen and Dallaire, And what they believe is that they believe comets either came close, or a comet came either very close to the Earth or in fact struck the Earth at about 11,500 years ago. And what it did is it changed the course and the nature of the planet. It caused the end of the Ice Age. So rather than the idea that the Ice Age ended as a gradual shifting, the poles very slowly started to melt, their theory, which is starting to be backed up by other scientists, is that the end of the Ice Age, or at least a major portion of it, took 3 years, and that the level of the world's oceans rose by 350 feet in 3 years, not 3,000 years. Relating to a subject I don't like to talk about too much, which is Atlantis, because there's too much garbage written about it, is that according to Plato, we're looking at the same timeline, that whatever Atlantis was disappeared about 11,500 to 12,000 years ago. And I think one problem is that when you read Plato, who got his information from an older Greek called Solon, who got his information from the Egyptians, who got their information from someone before, you lose a lot of information through the timeline. So for example, I've been involved with Native people most of my life, and what I do know is that when they tell you a story, you never interpret the story literally. When they tell you something, they're telling you poetry. So, for example, with Atlantis, the idea that there was a continent that sank is probably not the case, because any oceanographer will laugh at you. But if you interpret it as being the water rose and the land appeared to sink, then that is a logical possibility. Because any advanced civilization in modern times in general lives near the ocean or has access to the ocean. So if you have a rise of 350 feet in 3 years, you're causing probably any sophisticated population to have to move very rapidly from where they are. So I believe in the concept of Atlantis, not the name, but I think it was a global civilization. And another writer called Barbara Han Clow, based on Alan and Dallaire's work, but also based on the fact that her grandfather was a native Cherokee, she was able to take both the science and the oral tradition and put them together in timeline. And again, 11,500 to 11,700 years ago, there was a terrible event that happened on the planet. And some speculate that even what happened is that not only the melting of the poles, but also that's when our planet went from perfect alignment to 23.5 degrees. The consequence of that is not only the fact that, you would go from 2 seasons to 4 almost instantaneously. That would disrupt all of life on Earth automatically. And then the work of Dr. Paul Laviolette, he believes that at exactly the same time, 11,500 to around 11,700 or so years ago, there was an ejection from the core of our galaxy. And his theory, which is backed up by testing in ice cores, is called the galactic superwave. And that's that rather than the center of our galaxy being a black hole, it's a pulsar. And what a pulsar does is it pulses. So his theory is that approximately every 11, 12, or 13,000 years ago, it shifts depending, because the universe is not a precise clock. But around 11, 12, 13,000 years ago, there is a disruption or an emission from galactic center. And that energy of all forms, gamma rays, etc., travels through the galactic center. And at this time, it went straight through our solar system, and it pulled plasma from the sun and hit the Earth in very specific spots. It was not like a big ball of fire engulfed the Earth, because we wouldn't be here. But it hit high elevation sites, such as Peru, and it superheated the atmosphere temporarily, and that, he believes, is what caused the melting of the poles, again causing the rise in sea levels very rapidly, causing anyone alive to have to move. Graham Hancock has done a lot of work at attempting to look at sites underneath the ocean, especially off the coast of India and in the Mediterranean. And any time he's attempted that, governments have prohibited him from doing any work. But there is evidence from other researchers that inside the Mediterranean there are cities, and off the coast of India, especially because when the tsunami happened in 2007, I think it was, supposedly eyewitnesses who were Indian fishermen out fishing at sea, they were outside of the zone where the actual, because before the tsunami came, it had to pull the water from the tidal region back to fuel this thing. And they literally saw that for a very short time, cities that were exposed, or buildings, and then when the tsunami went through, they were covered up. And then also Dr. Robert Schoch, who I've mentioned before, his theory, again, around 11,700 years ago, was that the sun itself had a plasma disruption, and this is based again on science, that 11,500 to 11,700 years ago, the Earth or the sun became very active, which it's doing right now, but it was so disruptive at that point that it sent plasma, which were not only sunbursts, they actually struck the planet and did exactly the same thing as these other researchers are talking about. So you have 4 more or less independent studies and more stating that the end of the Ice Age was a very rapid event. Any civilization of any sophistication that existed prior to that time, if not completely wiped out, would have been wiped out to such a high percentage that most of the educated people would have died. And so most of their information, their technology would have been lost. The little pocket of people that did survive that repopulated the planet would have had memory, but they would have had myth rather than science. And when you look at any mythology of most indigenous cultures, their myths are usually based on fact. The trouble is, over such a long course of time, you have reinterpretation, and you have, the stories become more fantastic and larger and different. So in Egypt, which ties into Dr. Schoch, again, he being an expert on the erosion of stone, was brought by a man called John Anthony West to the site of the Sphinx. And if you don't know, the Sphinx is inside what's called the Sphinx enclosure. The Sphinx does not lie on flat land. It's inside this huge pit. And what Dr. Schoch was able to state as a geologist is that the weathering on the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure was not the result of wind and sand. It was the result of water. It had to be precipitation. So he was able to get in contact with climatologists, and they were able to build a computer model to go back in time to find out when that event could have been. And the result was approximately 8,000 years ago is when there could have been enough rain to cause this erosion. And immediately, practically every Egyptologist on the planet attacked him because dynastic Egypt is not supposed to go back more than about 5,100 years. So Dr. Schoch was dating the Sphinx's construction at least 2 or 3 years earlier, or at least the erosion earlier than the existence of the dynastic Egyptians. And this is a building right in front of the Sphinx. It's called the Sphinx Temple, and each one of these blocks is multi-ton, and it came from the Sphinx enclosure. So this giant temple complex, all of these blocks were cut out and moved and built. It's not like people were there chipping away to cut the Sphinx out of the stone. Someone had the technology to move multi-ton stones out of it and build a temple right in front of it. And again, you see the amount of weathering involved. And the Great Pyramid itself is, if you've never been to Egypt, you should go and look at this because it is mind-boggling in scale. Even being in Peru and Bolivia looking at things, when you're literally standing looking at the Great Pyramid, that's when you get a sense of what it is. It's difficult from photographs. But it is profoundly huge. 2,300,000 multi-ton blocks make up the Great Pyramid. And what's more intriguing is it's known that most of it is made of limestone. The limestone came from that exact area, but there is multi-ton granite inside, especially inside the chambers, as well as basalt like this. And all of the stone aside from the limestone was brought from great distance. All of the rose granite, which is in the Great Pyramid and other pyramids, was brought from 500 miles away somehow. And some of the stone that was moved weighs 1,000 tons. So it's unlikely they were dragging it across the desert. It's unlikely they were building boats or barges to move that, because you're talking 600 automobiles, and you can't build a papyrus raft, or even a wooden boat that could carry that. So it's one of the many, many mysteries of Egypt. But here, and it's not that evident in the photograph, unfortunately, is you see this line coming this way, like that. It is approximately 1/8 of an inch wide, and it cuts into the stone. And if you measure that arc and expand it to how big a saw could have been to do this cutting, the saw would have been at least 6 meters in diameter with a width of 1/8 of an inch. Something of that size, moving at high speed, we can't do because it would be so flexible and so unstable. And if any of you have worked with either stone or wood on even like a table saw, you know what the maximum load means, which is you can only push the material through the blade at a certain speed. After that, you're creating vibration. And the more vibration you create, the more unstable the cut, and eventually it'll shoot the material at you. So we have evidence, and in many places, of the use of circular saws, which had to have been under power, at least 6 meters in diameter. The other thing is, the standard idea is that this is one of the first pyramids, because it was an experiment. What they did is they started to build mud brick buildings, and then what they would do is they would add level after level like this because of stability. You make each level above smaller in order to make sure that the whole thing doesn't fall apart. However, there's no direct evidence that this is one of the older pyramids. It's actually more likely that the Great Pyramid is much older than that one, and that the Great Pyramids, plural, plus the Sphinx, plus the Sphinx Temple, plus the Valley Temple, plus other buildings predate the dynastic Egyptians by thousands of years, and possibly, according to oral tradition, and hopefully we'll get more science about this, prior to 11,700 years ago. So it's possible that buildings like this, some of the Peruvian, some of the Bolivian, and other ones, were built by this ancient civilization who were the victims of this massive cataclysm. The other question is, what was the function, for example, of the Great Pyramid? Of course, people say, well, it was a tomb for an arrogant king. Unfortunately, what we find is that the majority of archaeologists in general who look at foreign sites like Egypt, Peru, Bolivia, etc., they're taking their Western mindset with them when they try to interpret another people. And Europe, we know, was very barbaric in terms of you did have kings who were despots. They treated themselves as the highest level of life, and everyone else was more or less a peon. However, ancient societies in other parts of the world were not like that. The Inca were not kings, the Inca were not rulers. The Inca were caretakers. And I know that from working with native people to this day. Someone who is a chief is not the highest person. It's the opposite. He is responsible for the livelihood, and we know that the Inca were that way, so it's quite possible that ancient Egyptians, etc., were that way as well, that they wouldn't think, use all the resources because I'm arrogant and special, build me a massive thing for me to be buried in, because the precision of this building is almost 21st century. For example, again, the conventional story is Khufu, who was a pharaoh, decided to have this built. He said, cut a line into the bedrock because I want to be buried here. And then as they were building it, he changed his mind and he said, no, wait a second, I want to be buried in number 5. And then he changed his mind and he said, no, wait a second, I want to be buried in number 8. Now the precision of this passageway, the descending passage, they know by laser it's more than 300 feet long, and it deviates from laser perfection by 1/8 of an inch. The Egyptians did not have the capability of doing that work, no matter what the pharaoh may have wanted. But when you bring an engineer such as Christopher Dunn to look at this, he believes, and this relates to some of the other subjects that we're discussing in terms of lost technology or free energy. Christopher Dunn believes that the Giza pyramids were power plants. And how they worked was that there are tunnels, a series of tunnels that go from the Nile, and from the Nile they go straight to and underneath the Great Pyramid and the other 2 pyramids on that site. And that in his case, he believes that it was chemicals they were using to create hydrogen, but other people believe that what they were doing is they were moving water, and it was gravity fed underneath the Great Pyramid, and that at one time there were mechanisms inside the Great Pyramid that were capable of splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, creating energy. So that I find actually is a more logical idea than the idea that it was a tomb. The thing, though, is that if these buildings were there 12,000 years ago, were abandoned and actually shut down because of the shift of the Earth from its perfect alignment off to 23.5 degrees, the destruction of the civilization, the loss of knowledge. Then 5,000 years ago, the dynastic Egyptians show up and they see these structures, and of course they adopt them. And it's quite possible that Khufu said, "Put my name on that building because I am the pharaoh." And the other thing is that the Grand Gallery. If you go into the Grand Gallery, there's no reason why it would be immense the way it is to access a place where you're burying the king. The sonics and vibrational characteristics are profound, and it resonates again to between A and A sharp. The other thing a lot of people don't know is that the Great Pyramid is not a 4-sided, it is an 8-sided pyramid. The flat sides are not flat, they gently taper in to the center. And engineers have looked at that and they say that shape is beautiful for either sonics or acoustics or for vibration. But you can only see it at certain times of the light, looking straight down, I would guess, from a helicopter onto it. But it's something that if it was built as a tomb is an engineering phenomenon that would be very difficult to do. Also, in the Queen's Chamber, there are the shafts that go up, and this is one of them, so-called Gantenbrink's door, because a man called Gantenbrink was able to build a little robot and was custom designed to go up the shafts in order to see what happened. And when it went up, then it reached this door, and there was nothing he could do, so they sent the robot back down. Later on, I believe he was allowed to come back once, and then he was kicked out of the country because he was able to get a drill attached to the little upawat, and it went up, and it drilled a hole through, and what they found out was that though they thought these were 2 little flanges for sealing, the area off or whatever, Christopher Dunn, after being able to see photographs of the interior, believes that this was actually part of the wiring system of the Great Pyramid, that again, it's part of the electrical nature, and the reason why they're so eroded was because of the wear of the functioning of the Giza power plant. And another aspect to it, again, getting to the idea of free energy, or even Tesla, who I don't think invented what he knew, but he found out what it was and used ancient information, were the obelisks, of which there are many, used as almost like occult symbols now. Of course, there's one in St. Peter's Square, there's one in London, one in Paris, etc. But what you see when you look at these from very up close is the precision of the cutting of the hieroglyphs is inferior to the surface of the stone. And what's probably the case is that these obelisks are thousands of years older than the hieroglyphs, but at one point a pharaoh decided that a flat, empty surface was a great place to have his name and story written on. And going as an aspect of the Giza power plant system, this is what it could have functioned as. The power plants, being the pyramids, could have been the generators, and the obelisks were the receivers. And they would have been strategically placed at so-called sacred sites. But what you find out, if you go to so-called sacred sites where you do find evidence of lost ancient technology, is that these, as well as possibly some in Peru and Bolivia and other locations, may have had a pragmatic energy generating function. And because of the nature of the stone that was used, there still is energy at work, but it's at a very tiny scale compared to what it would have been like. And that's why when you go into the Great Pyramid, you almost automatically go into an alternate state of consciousness, and that's why it's a great place to meditate, because there still is energy moving through the structure. And again, if you harmonize to A or A sharp in the King's Chamber, the volume expands. It's not like you're just hitting a tone. You're hitting a tone where all of a sudden it's much louder than the sound you're making. Maybe you're striking the exact harmony or resonance of how this particular building functioned. And this is the man, if you ever go to Egypt, Yusuf Awiyan. He is probably the most knowledgeable person of so-called alternative knowledge in Egypt. And it's based on his family lineage. He's in fact descended from the Comitian people who existed prior to the dynastic Egyptians. And another thing that we saw when we were on the Giza Plateau, very much out of bounds, but it's because Yusuf was born and grew up across the street. You can see the Sphinx's head right up there. But because his father was a guide for more than 70 years in this area, Yusuf knows all of the guards. And so if he wants access, he doesn't have to ask the government anything. He goes to the guards, and the guards let us through and let us wander around the Giza Plateau, because Yusuf wanted to show me the shafts and the tunnel system that riddle or are underneath the Giza Plateau that most people don't know about. So this is a covering of one of these shafts, and it's approximately 10 feet by 10 feet. At the moment, it goes down about 100 feet, but it's filled with sand. So over the course of thousands of years, it's very likely that sand has been filling it up. There's no sense in taking the sand out, but these are supposed to go down hundreds of feet, vertically down, and intersect with the tunnel system that goes under not only the Giza Plateau, but specifically underneath the pyramids. And it's the water channeling system that originally came from the Nile, but not the Nile where it is. There is a lot of evidence that 12,000 years ago, the Nile was farther to the west, and you can see it in the topography. It was a much bigger, wider river. And that's where these tunnels connect to. They connect to the ancient Nile, strictly out of bounds, unless you know Yusuf. And this is another one. Again, it's 10 feet by 12 feet and drops down approximately 100 feet. So because of his connections, we were able to go underneath the Giza Plateau. And this is level 1. And these openings were everywhere. but we only had 4 hours. He told me that this is level 1, but there are at least 2 levels beneath it. So we're going back in April, and I would like to go into level 2 if possible. And the best book on the subject, I believe, of ancient pre-dynastic Egypt is this book written by Stephen Mailer, and it's called The Land of Osiris because what he talks about is from the oral tradition perspective, the fact that the Giza Plateau area is the oldest by far part of ancient Egypt. The rest of it, Aswan area and all the areas with the beautiful, true dynastic Egyptian works, which are masterpieces, are outside of this area. And another subject that fascinates me is the concept of who Osiris was. Because, again, a lot of you have seen the depictions of elongated heads from Akhenaten in that time period. And I'm wondering if it kind of relates to the studies I've been doing in Peru of the elongated skull people. And why it is that people practice cranial deformation in order to look like these mysterious ancient ones. Of course, the automatic idea goes to that these, people were aliens or related. We are presently doing DNA testing of the ancient Paracas people of Peru. It's taken a long time, though, because the DNA is more than 2,000 years old, so it's very time-consuming and expensive to get the results. But once I do get results, I will let people know. Another building which is in Egypt is called the Bent Pyramid. And the conventional archaeologist's idea of why, or Egyptologist's idea of why it is the way it is in terms of shape, is that literally, and I think it's racism, that the ancient Egyptian engineers got halfway into constructing this massive structure and figured out that the angle was wrong. And so they had to compensate by changing the angle in order to reach the peak. And that's completely stupid. They would have built a model first and figured out the angle. But according to the oral tradition, this again was supposedly built by an emperor or a pharaoh called Sneferu. But when you learn from someone like Stephen Mailer, who knows the language much more than the average Egyptologist, it actually means, Sneferu means double harmony. And so when the famous designer Buckminster Fuller, who was a Canadian, went and saw this structure, that's exactly what he said about it. He said it looks like it has 2 angles because it was supposed to have 2 different frequencies. And inside of it, again, a so-called burial chamber, but the baffling system and the accuracy of its construction, the acoustics are so profound that I think the idea that it was a vibratory structure is far more plausible than the idea that it was a tomb. And again, Egyptologists insist that these are the tools that were used to do the work. And the great question, or the great argument is, okay, well then where are the tools? Where are the high-tech tools? And the analogy I would give is that if you had an incredible level of technology and you had machines of some kind made of gold and crystal and who knows what, different materials to build up, then you wouldn't necessarily find them buried in the ground. If they were abandoned, then they would have been abandoned on the ground. And then much later, after this civilization was no longer in existence, somebody shows up, much like if you took a cell phone and you threw it in a part of the jungle somewhere where no one had ever been in contact with Western civilization, they would find this thing a curiosity, and they would open it up, and they would see a light flashing, and then they would think it's a very special thing, not a god, but a very special thing. Eventually the battery dies. It's not doing its magic job anymore. So then they're curious and they take it apart. And then they see something shiny inside, which is maybe gold. They take that out and they make an ornament out of it. Somebody else takes other parts of it. I think any of the ancient machines would have been recycled. Anything made of gold would have been stripped off because these things don't do anything anymore. and your culture doesn't understand what it is. And over time, it's the same thing as an automobile. If you abandon an automobile somewhere, someone's going to steal the tires quite quickly, and then the radio and other parts. So that's my explanation, at least. You're not going to find somebody, unless this stuff was buried on purpose, which is possible, but none has been found. This is another example of Yusuf with cut stone surface. The diameter of the saw that would have cut through this basalt would have been at least 6 meters to 8 meters in diameter, and the cutting pattern, which means that every rotation of the saw makes a groove or it makes an impression in the stone as it's moving. The speed at which this saw moved, by some experts, is twice the speed of what a 21st century saw can do. And these we find as well. We find these scattered all over the place. Precision drill holes in the middle of the desert. Nobody in recent times would go out there with a drill to core sample something like this, because there are lots of them. But it takes an eye to see them. This gives you a sense of the size of them. And again, the feed rate, which is the rate at which the cutter is going through the stone, in this case rose granite, is approximately at least twice the speed of what a modern diamond cutting drill can do. And unfortunately, you can't see this too well, but this will show you the impression. I have lots of photos on my website, etc., but you see the pattern of the cut as it goes. It's approximately every 2 to 3 millimeters is one rotation of this cutting tool. We also find strange things like this. This material is called quartzite. It's very hard. And these strange tub-looking things were not originally in this place at Abu Ghurab, which is in the desert of Egypt, but they were scattered about. Nobody has any idea what they were for, but conventional Egyptology says that they were the bowls, or they were giant bowls for the sacrificial blood of special bulls for some reason. But the thing is, anybody who's ever made a sink, the trouble is once you get the blood in the bowl, how do you get the blood out of the bowl when the drain hole is only halfway down? The drain hole should be at the bottom or lower down. But again, in each one of these, you have this very precise, cored out drill hole. And then here's Mirene. And this is the Serapeum, which is completely amazing. It's only been open or reopened for a year, because it was thought too dangerous to go inside because the ceiling is supposedly unstable. But these are boxes made of gray granite and rose granite. The boxes themselves weigh 70 tons, and the lids weigh 10 to 15 tons. These are located, there are 28 of them, I believe. They're in a tunnel underneath the desert. No one knows how they got the boxes in to begin with, how they moved them from the quarry 500 miles away. But also the lid, for some reason, was cut out of the same block of stone. They fit together because they were once one piece. And again, Christopher Dunn has taken his instruments and measured the surfaces outside and inside, and they are within 2/10,000ths of an inch in precision of flatness. And this is Stephen Mailer, but this is an incredible example of the fact that, again, the precision of this surface is as close to being perfectly flat as is technically possible, and yet the hieroglyphics on them look like they were done with a nail or a screwdriver. They are so awful in terms of quality. So most Egyptologists say, well, because we're reading what's written on the box, and the box is telling us who made it and how it was made. But that is like somebody going up to a Maserati that was just made after someone has taken a key and carved a story into it and said, Bob the plumber made and designed this car. It's the same kind of story. And that I find actually at this point completely silly. You can run your hand up and down this surface, and then you look at the quality of the hieroglyphics, and it does look like a 5-year-old did the hieroglyphic work. It's not the work of the same time period. Nobody would be allowed to do such awful workmanship on top on top of something out of hard stone that is technically almost impossible to do. And then this is the interior of the box itself. It's a smooth, it's illegal to do this, which I did, but it's as smooth on the inside as it is on the outside. And as well is the statuary, and this is one of the more interesting stories because Christopher Dunn, the engineer, he works, or recently retired, but he worked in the aeronautics industry designing and making precision parts for jet engines. So in terms of modern technology, there are very few things that exist which require a tolerance as tight as a jet engine. Anything slightly out of precise workmanship blows the engine up. So he's been at this for 30 or 40 years, or it was his career. He was a machinist before that, so he has hands-on knowledge of how materials feel when they're precise. He can just use his fingers. So he's an expert on that. But what he did is he started to look at the statuary because he noticed that they were just, this is not the only example, but a number of the ones you'll see that say Ramses on them, of which Ramses went crazy with having his name put on sculptures, is that this material is called diorite, and it is 8 on the Mohs scale out of 10. So the only material that can cut diorite is diamond, nothing else. Doesn't matter how long you're sitting there pounding with another stone at it, you're not going to create this kind of precision. But what he found is that a lot of the, especially rose granite statues, he would run his hand along the headdress part of it, and he couldn't feel a flaw. This way, like the curve this way and the curve that way. I've been a sculptor all my life, and I know you can't get that level of precision. You always make mistakes because of the nature of human hand-eye coordination. So he started to do studies, computer modeling, and what he found out is that with a number of the so-called Ramses statues, some of which are this big, others which are much bigger, that the precision of workmanship of those sculptures could have only been achieved with machining technology. And not just machining as in somebody with some kind of tool cutting it, a machine that is called a CNC machine, which is a computer-controlled machine that goes in with a cutting head, and it is programmed to do cutting. That is how all modern cars are designed, or at least the prototypes are done. Cars used to be done with some Italian designer going like this and shaping it. Now it's all done by robotics, and that's why when you run your hand across the surface or anything like this is not something that was done by hand. It was done by a computer program that was able to go in perfectly do the cutting job. And so as he analyzed some of the faces and other features of the Ramses statues, that's what he found. He would take clear plastic, put it over top, put a line right down the center of the face, and then he would draw and measure out all of the characteristics. And then he would switch it over to the other side, and the precision was basically perfect from one side to the other. Now, A, a human face is not perfect, and B, there's no sculptor in the world that can achieve that level. We're talking within much, much, much smaller than a millimeter difference from one side to the other. And this is an example of how he achieved that on certain features. The ears, no, but other features. So he honestly believes that some of these ancient sculptures were created using a technology similar to what we have, which is called a CNC machine. It would go down, it would cut one side of it three-dimensionally, and then come back, and the program would simply invert the program, and then it would go and do the other side like that. And what we do know, because when you look at the detail of the cartouche, which is the name put on a lot of the Ramses statues, the quality of the workmanship of the cartouche is far inferior to the workmanship itself. So the theory is what happened is that these sculptures are thousands of years older than the dynastic Egyptians. During the time of Ramses, for example, a number of them were found, and his priests, because they were actually in charge of the entire society, when they would find or reveal one of these, they would say, "Great Ramses, we found this sculpture. we should have your name put on this. And he'd say, sounds great. So they would put his name on it. But all of those statues are attributed to the time of Ramses II, when in fact they could have been done much, much older or much farther back in time. And just a list of some of the books I have done. And now I'm open to questions if anyone has any. Thank you.
No questions? Yes.
Hi. Brilliant lecture, I think.
Thank you.
I just saw through the tons of books you've done. The last one was the Nazca Lines.
Yeah.
I was actually there in '97.
I'm sorry?
I was actually there in '97,
Uh-huh.
and I just figured maybe you have a theory of any connection to the.
I'm sorry.
Any connection to the theory of the aliens you've mentioned here that could be possible as visitors? Do they have any connection to the Nazca Lines?
Uh-huh.
What's your theory on that?
The theory?
Yeah.
Well, the Nazca is like anything, it's much more complicated. You can't fit anything into one theory, Nazca especially, because it's not just the lines, it's the figures. And I was affiliated with a TV series called Ancient Aliens for a while, and they did a recent one called Beyond Nazca, and it was appalling. I mean, I don't mind the ancient alien theory, but when that's the only theory, again, doing that kind of thing is insinuating that ancient people are stupid, you know, and suspicious and God, you know, and worshiping everything, which is racism. So I'm glad I wasn't on that one, because I would have, you know, shot a number of the individuals. It's, you know, it's terrible. But the basic thing is, I looked at all of the theories of Nazca, from the idea that it was superstitious Indians in loincloths doing it, to the idea that aliens came and did it, and everything in between. But it's too complicated, and I think what happened was there was a culture called the Paracas who lived on the coast of Peru before the Nazca ever existed. And they built what was called the candelabro, which is a 500-foot tall geoglyph in the shape almost like a trident. And so that has been dated to the Paracas people. The interesting thing is it could only have been done out at sea, because you can only see it at sea. And then what happened is that they started to move inland. They lived northwest of Nazca. And they started to move inland towards what is called Nazca, and they started to make more of these geoglyph things and shapes and that sort of thing, mainly on the sides of the mountains, and you can see a lot of Nazca from different hilltops. It's not like they can't be seen. That's a lie. There's also the idea that they really overdo, that there's a mountain there where someone came and cut the top off, which is not true. Because Nazca is like Arizona or New Mexico in the United States. It's so ancient in terms of geology that there were periods of time where there was massive flooding for thousands of years, lowering the level of some of the surfaces and exposing these flat tops. And that's what Nazca is. So these Paracas were building more and more complex figures as they were going. And then they finally, it seems, built what's called the astronaut, which is this guy going like this. And again, he is on the side of a hill. From another mountain, you can see him. So it's possible that people could somehow translate, the designer could translate to the builders, maybe with runners, I don't know, but how to do that. The lines themselves, some of them were ceremonial because they do point to sunrise and sunset. Others point to constellations rising and falling. But the majority of them were most likely made as a mapping system of underground water, because Nazca gets an inch of rain a year. And so all of the water that feeds the agriculture of Nazca goes underground, from the Andes under to the ocean. And it's proven that Nazca did build, they cut these holes into the earth to access the water. So I think they were building a series of mapping systems of where the water moved, because most of them the lines go from a hilltop downwards. But there's such a mess of angles and connections that it's been proven that they do not fit a map of the sky. And a woman called Maria Reich, who studied Nazca for 50 years, insisted that they were a map of the heavens. It doesn't turn out that they were. And then also, it's probable that the animal figures themselves were ceremonial. Each one of them, for example, the hummingbird, it is one line that goes like this around and back to the beginning, but the beginning and the end never meet. And that is an entry point. So they were most likely ceremonial. You would go down the beak of the hummingbird and do a series of ceremonies of some kind, and then work your way back out. And then people say, but wait, you can't see, the figures you can't see unless you're, above, looking down. But that's not really true. Because again, it's important to get somebody outside sometimes of the archaeology department to look at it. And this one guy had a very brilliant idea. He said they could have simply taken a piece of bark or a piece of stone and set up a grid system this way and that way and drawn the spider, for example. And then they took cotton and they took stakes and they staked out a giant area in scale with that. And then he had his builders, based on a grid system, do that design work. I think the Nazca themselves were responsible for a number of the lines and most of the figures, but the Paracas culture did some of the work before that. And so it's a complicated story. It's not just one theory. And I do like our Eric von Daniken to some degree, but the idea that somebody would be capable of traveling through intergalactic space and would need a runway in order to land their craft is completely, that is 20th century thinking. So that's my theory about Nazca. And the reason why they are on average about this deep now, and the reason why they've lasted so long is because it basically never rains in Nazca, not even an inch a year. Global climate change or HARP or somebody's doing this is starting to destroy some of it. But it's a complicated story, just like Egypt is a complex story, or Peru or whatever. And as I did say, I enjoyed the Ancient Aliens experience. My mind is very open to the idea that we are products of or have been in contact with other beings. But to use that as the automatic assumption before you say, couldn't ancient people have been smart enough to do this work? You should think about, did ancient people do it first? And especially ancient people we know about. Then if not, then what about ancient people we don't know about? And then if you exclude all of that, then possibly somebody else was doing it.
My next question, because you talked a lot about 11,000, 12,000 BC. Is there any ancient people or artifacts, I know there is, but anything you found very interesting dating way older than that? Or,
way older?
Yeah, or older than that?
No, at this point I'm limiting myself to that because I'm a biologist by background. To some degree, I believe in evolution, but I don't believe in all of it because there are a lot of mistakes. There are a lot of holes in Darwinian evolution. I don't think we necessarily, ascended from apes personally, but I think there are too many claims of. I mean, there are weird objects that have been found that have been found in ancient coal beds and all sorts of things, but I haven't seen evidence of really strong evidence of anything super ancient. I at this point just like to look at the period of the end of the Ice Age and the idea that there was a civilization that had what was called a golden age prior to, but not something as flowery as the Atlantean thing. Atlantean-like, but not a continent, not a beautiful, harmonious society that suddenly one day collapsed, but somebody was here. Our ancestors, I think, were here, and they did phenomenal things that we are reinventing. And that's where the idea of using water to power things is not a new idea, but it's a timely idea because somebody else did it 12,000 years ago very successfully. So that's why I'm really glad that I was given the opportunity to come, because my subject seemed completely out of whack with everything else, but it does tie in, because taking in the historical perspective, and what you learn, it's great to learn from the past to use in the future and be respectful of the past and be aware of the fact that our history goes back much longer than what we've generally been taught is important for us as human beings.
Great lecture. Thank you. My question to you is, you showed us some pictures of quite similar stonework, the walls and stuff from, many parts of the world. Do you think those civilizations were connected in any way, since they had the same building technique?
Well, I think there was global movement, definitely, thousands of years before even the Vikings, who were incredible at what they did. The Vikings, when I was living in Hawaii, because of the arrogance of I was working on this giant voyaging canoe project, and because of the arrogance of some of the Hawaiians, they were mocking the Vikings, and I said, they said, well, look what we're building. The Vikings had nothing. And it's like, have you ever seen one of the designs of those things? These people were moving cattle across the Atlantic Ocean. So, be site-specific. Your canoe is great for here. The Vikings were great for, where they were. But being a sailor and having talked to people who have done global sailing across the Pacific or the Atlantic is not complicated. You don't need a sophisticated ship. You need something that will float, not fill up with water, and have a decent enough sail to be a propulsion unit. And also, you do not, the arrogance of some television programs when they say, it took a clock before we knew what latitude was, and then from there, we could conquer the world. I met a Polynesian navigator who was this tall, the last of his kind, and he had 300 stars mapped in his head. The reason why he had to know that was because if it's a cloudy night, you need to know one or two. But his mind was a maritime navigational machine. And so, again, what I like to really point out is that ancient civilizations, or even the descendants of ancient civilizations, just because they didn't have what we call technology doesn't mean that they didn't know how to do things possibly as well as we do. If you drop your GPS off your sailboat, you're screwed. But the Polynesian people still know how to read wind, waves, birds, weather, etc., and all together as a machine. So I think definitely we have a lot of evidence that people easily had the capacity of circumnavigating the world long before any European did that, though what they did was great. And what's key is, if you look at very specific locations, one of them is where the Olmec people lived in southern Mexico. And that is where North America comes down. It's not as far south as Panama, but it narrows down to about 100 miles in diameter. And that's where you see this ancient so-called influence These giant stone heads with African features, but also Southeast Asian features in them. And I think that these very ancient people, being very intelligent and conservative of energy, they knew where this narrow point of land was. It became a rich culture because of trade between the two oceans and what they would simply do, and this is even what Pizarro did when he was trying to find Peru, is they would take their ship, say they would move across the Atlantic to this narrow isthmus. They would take the most important parts of that ship apart, because you always have carpenters on board, move them across and rebuild something, and then keep sailing rather than trying to go around South America. Just as an example, but because the Paracas people, for example, who have these elongated skulls, we've been able to show that the royalty had brownish reddish hair genetically. Indians do not have that. Indians have black hair, doesn't matter where you go, unless they had European influence. The Paracas, minimum of 2,000 years ago, had brownish reddish hair. So where did that come from? And the intriguing thing in one of my books is that you find the exact same character trait on the west coast of Peru, Easter Island, Tahiti, Hawaii, and New Zealand. So I think you're genetically talking about a maritime culture that was able to move easily through the Pacific Ocean. And Thor Heyerdahl, again, was vilified by the scientific and academic community for his ideas. And now his ideas are being proven genetically that there was movement in the Pacific long before the Polynesians existed. Hence our example on Easter Island. There are no heads, there are full bodies. And it's spoken of that these elongated, skulled people lived there with red hair. The first European to go to Easter Island was called, what's his name? Van Roggeveen. And his description was he saw short people, he saw tall people, he saw tanned people, he saw white-skinned people, he saw black-haired people, red-haired people, and blonde-haired people. And he was supposedly the first European to ever arrive. So clearly, and from the constructions, the oldest constructions are the finest, and they're telling us that somebody was there before the Polynesians got. It's very sticky subject when you go to Easter Island to talk about this, because the Polynesians are like, we were here first, but I think themselves that the Polynesians would like the idea that they had older, that they're from an older bloodline too. They're a mix of people. And it's the same in New Zealand. There were people living in New Zealand before the Maori people ever existed, but those people were exterminated by the Maori. And Hawaii too. They talk about, actually the first people that the native Hawaiians talk about who lived in Hawaii were called the Mu. And the land was called Mu. And that's the older name of Lemuria is a term made up in the 19th century or 18th century. But the people of Hawaii say, we have been here for 25,000 years. But they won't tell it to the general public. I get inroads into this stuff because I've been involved with Native people since childhood. And they ask me, they say, why should I tell you this information? And I say, because people are lying about you. It's the same when we went to Easter Island. This lady, elder said, if I tell you this information, what does this do for my people? And I said, because they say you were cannibals, you cut down all the trees, and I don't think it's, and she said, of course that's not the story. And I said, well, let me write a book about that, because you won't. She said, well, we don't care what the outside world thinks. And it's like, well, I'm going to write it anyway, because I don't like these stereotypes or these myths going around about the primitive nature of intelligent human beings. Is the simple answer to it.
Yeah, I was thinking that all this knowledge and this advanced technology, if this is true, that it was this very intelligent civilization, how did all this knowledge get lost? Was it different civilizations at the same time, and this one civilization? Because otherwise, why didn't they just rebuild it if they survived, or what happened?
Well, I think the simple answer, again, is that the end of the Ice Age was a very dramatic event. Took 3 years. Anyone living near the ocean, which would in general be a sophisticated culture, would have to leave very quickly. It's possible that the axis of the Earth changed at the same time, because that's where there is the evidence of the woolly mammoths living in Siberia who've been found frozen in the tundra with a mouthful of food. They were flash frozen. They didn't slowly die. So it is possible that the axis of the Earth changed. That would have changed global climate automatically. It would have changed the number of seasons from 2 to 4. The rising of the sea level causes people to move. Massive, die-off of people. And so when you take 80% of the population and they're dead, then a lot of the information of that civilization is gone, because you're not going to be able to rapidly pass it on. And I think what does remain, again, is mythology. I honestly believe that in all of the ancient civilizations that we talk about, when they talk about myths, I think they're talking about their history. But it's so poetic now. For example, there's growing evidence that the so-called Titans of Greece, Zeus and Apollo, etc., that they were real people, but that in the distant past there was a major climate shift of global proportions. They were forced to leave their land of Greece, and there's growing evidence that the sites in Turkey of high elevation are much older than was thought. So the theory is that the Titans moved into the highlands of Turkey and lived there for, their lifetime, but went on for thousands of years. And finally, when there was a return of these Greek descendants into Greece, the ancestors became myth, but they were real people. Well, no, it's not that there's no trace. There are fascinating things inside the Cairo Museum, but they have been mislabeled. Like, there's one thing called the schist disc. It's about this big. It has fins on it. It's all made of one piece of stone. The stone is only probably 4 millimeters thick. And the stone itself is very hard, but it's very sort of fragile. It's a mixed up term, hard but fragile, but it's a very delicate material and hard material to work. And so it is sitting in a glass case. They keep moving it around the museum because it took us 20 minutes to find it. But when engineers look at that, they say that is an impeller, or that is something that moved at high speed, and the fins were for either moving air or water. But the label is pharaonic fruit plate. And it is conspiracy theory, but it's probably true that a lot of these pieces that don't fit in with the pharaonic timeline or description are hiding in boxes in the basements there. And in the Smithsonian is a terrible institution for that. They have so many artifacts they've found that have been documented from the 19th century of not things such as giants, but people like 7.5 feet tall with red hair who lived in the United States at the same time as the native people or earlier. But all of those skeletal remains were immediately taken to the Smithsonian and are in storage, and even academics are not allowed to access them because somebody wants a deliberate timeline of history to be told. And they don't want to go back prior to 3,100 or 3,500 BC for religious, political, and other reasons. I mean, the thing about when I went to school, it was all about the Greek civilization, that they were the Greeks were the first democracy, and then the Romans, were the next great, and then the Europeans, and it's like, this is taught to me as a European from Europeans. It's clear that the Egyptian civilization was far more highly evolved than the Greeks or the Romans or anyone afterwards were, but what they did as smart people was, and what native people to this day do, is they hide their information. So when the Greeks came into Egypt and said, tell us your history, tell us everything about you. It's like the Greek or the Egyptians would often make up stories about their history because the Greeks were not allowed it. It's like going into somebody's house and going, tell me about your family kind of thing. It's like if you move aggressively in, you naturally get people to be defensive. And that's what happened with the so-called Rosetta Stone. Egyptologists use the Rosetta Stone as the exact translation because they say, oh my God, it has hieroglyphics, it has Greek, and it has Coptic Christian. We can use that. But that was simply a tool of commerce that was developed. And so the first superficial level of the meaning of hieroglyphics were told to the Greeks so that they could use it for commerce. The spiritual level, the scientific level, and the other levels of the sacred ancient Suf language, which is Egyptian, was never taught to the Greeks because the Greeks didn't deserve to know it. And so by using the Rosetta Stone, you're using it as a direct translation, taking the hieroglyphics and directly translating, and anybody who knows anything about the ancient knowledge of Egypt just breaks out laughing and says, none of that means any of that. So the name, the language is so ancient that one word or one name has a profound number of deeper and deeper and deeper meanings depending upon the level of access. They weren't simply names. And as a very simple example, Akhenaten, who people are just enamored with for good reason, his original name was Amenhotep IV. And Amen is a period of the sun. It's a time period. It's a period of the day which translates to a period of incredibly long time. So Amen is the last time of the day. And so it means the hidden, because that's when the sun has gone down. Before that was the golden age. When you look at the big stretch of time, that was the time of Aten. That was the full bloom. So that's why this man said, I am changing my name to Akhenaten, which means the shadow of the golden age, basically. Because he was doing a renaissance. He was bringing back the ancient belief system. That's why he built his own city. He didn't worship the sun. He worshiped the sun as a symbol of the blooming, full blooming of consciousness. And our word Amen, which people think means go with God, comes from ancient Egyptian, and it means the hidden. So that's a simple example of what his name meant. Like he made up his own name. But any one of these things, it's if you can, and it's rarely possible, but if you can get involved in the oral tradition of a people, if it's still remembered, your comprehension goes up manyfold, but you have to be on a level of trust with the people, because too many people go in, whether they're archaeologists, anthropologists, writers, or whoever, take the information from the people, make a lot of money or do whatever with it, or make up stories, like the whole thing about the Mayans being cannibalistic was a very short period of Mayan history. It was at the end of Mayan history when the ecosystem had just gone to hell that they began blood sacrifice. The Aztecs did. The Inca never did. But the Catholic priests made up that story about a lot of Peruvians think that the Inca did blood sacrifice or sacrificed children. They never did. But it was a great tool. When the Spanish moved in, you have to reprogram the people. You don't win them by beating them on the head. You win them through changing their way of looking at themselves. And that's why the first building that the Spanish destroyed is the Coricancha, because that was the spiritual center. They went in and they leveled it to the ground and built a church. So all these lost Inca people, they're used to going for salvation or prayer to this building. All of a sudden Jesus appears, this kind of thing. Sorry, I'm going way off track.
Yes, while we are finishing this amazing, brilliant lecture and very fascinating stuff.
Thank you.
And we thank very much Brien Foerster for his research and beautiful lecture.
Thank you.